So hello and welcome to another one of our Cromwellian Conversations, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by one of our regular contributors, friend of the museum, Miranda Malins. I'm sure many people will know through her wonderful first novel, The Puritan Princess, which is set during the Cromwellian period and the height of the Protectorate. Miranda, of course, is not only a sort of a historian and published author, but also a trustee of the Cromwell Association as well. Miranda, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a chat about your new book. So it's wonderful to chat this afternoon. So
thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you for asking me. Lovely to meet you.
You were just saying to me that it's sort of, you've just got your hands on the hard copies today. Does it still feel real when you sort of, you get your hands on the new book for the first time?
There is something about the tangible quality of it, definitely. You can't quite believe that what you're writing is a book when it's just a Word document on your screen. However much you stare at it. And then when it's finally, and it's literally just arrived in the post today, folks. So this is a world exclusive for the Cromwell. These beauties just arrived in the post half an hour ago, so it's the first time I've seen it, and it is amazing. It's such a it's humbling, and it's a real honor. You just think, gosh, of all the books that I've read and loved throughout my whole life, and the fact that I've got to write one, is just wonderful. So huge thrill.
So obviously your first one, Puritan Princess, which has been a great success, obviously kind of told very much through the viewpoint of Frances Cromwell, so Cromwell's youngest daughter, and looking at the kind of very much the sort of latter days of the Protectorate, those sort of last days. So give us a little bit of an overview of the story with this particular one, because you've gone back much earlier with this, haven't you?
I have. It's a sort of prequel, or as I like to think of it, a sister novel, given that they're all about sisters, the Cromwell girls. But yes, so I'm taking the Cromwell family back, in time, back a decade or so, to really look at how Oliver Cromwell and his family rose to prominence through the civil wars themselves. And the sort of the heroine this time, and the vehicle, for this story, is Bridget Cromwell, who is Oliver's oldest daughter this time. So I've gone from youngest daughter now to oldest daughter. And she's just a really, really interesting character, because she lives through her father's extraordinary rise through the 1640s, and she's an adult actually during the Civil War itself, and does sort of get involved. I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but I think it isn't a plot spoiler for fans and friends of the Cromwell Museum to say that she marries Henry Ireton, who is a prominent...
No. I think a quick look at Wikipedia will work that one out for most media.
I don't think that's not much of a spoiler, really. But in so doing, she sort of puts herself at the centre of the parliamentarian war effort, and the build-up to what is often called the revolution, the trial of the king and the regicide, because she is the daughter of Oliver Cromwell and married to Henry Ireton. She's the daughter of one and the wife of the other, arguably leading figures at this time, propelling this parliamentarian movement forward. And she lives with the army and travels around with them as well, so she sees some extraordinary things. So I just wanted to tell her story, put her back into the center of the action, and she has been totally overlooked hitherto. She's never really been written about before.
No, absolutely. How would you kind of characterize her compared to, say, Frances beforehand? Because I mean, obviously Frances is the youngest one, and therefore, as you say, almost the princess in terms of the way she's sort of brought up a little bit in terms of the later daughter out of it. Bridget's always struck me as being the sort of as the oldest one, and because of those circumstances you mentioned just there, she just struck me as being a little bit more the kind of the bolshy one, sort of the one who's a bit more politicized than any of the others. I mean, is that right? I mean, how have you presented her?
That's how I see her, and you alluded to it there. I find it really fascinating that Cromwell has these 4 daughters who divided naturally into 2 pairs, two older ones and 2 younger ones. And as you say, the younger ones, Mary and Frances, are children all the way through the Civil Wars, and really kind of grow into maturity under the Protectorate, were living at Hampton Court and Whitehall as teenagers with their unmarried women, unmarried girls, with their father as head of state. Whereas for Bridget and for Elizabeth, or Betty, the older daughters, you know, they grow up and get married themselves during the Civil Wars, when Cromwell is just a, you know, as we know, he grows in importance during that period, but at the beginning he's just a, you know, a local kind of cavalry commander and an MP. So they have very, very different upbringings, and I tried to bring that out in the Puritan Princess, where Frances is flouncing around in her beautiful dresses and thinking about which, you know, foreign prince she might marry. And there's Bridget, who being rather stern and austere and sort of saying, well, you know, it wasn't like this when I was a child, you know. But it's a silly point, but actually that's a way into the fascination of Cromwell himself, the fact that he is this everyman Huntingdon farmer, and then goes from that position to be ending up being basically king. And you can see that so beautifully through the contrasting lives of his daughters. So Bridget I see as much more of a sort of godly and she can be quite severe, quite sort of puritanical. I did worry at first that whether I was going to be able to make her into a likable heroine, but then I took as my models, you know, that there are wonderful kind of strong and serious women in literature, from Dorothea Brooke through to Eleanor Dashwood, through to, you know, you name it, and she's modelled on one of them. She's got a beautiful younger sister in Betty. If you think about the Taming of the Shrew, there's the, you know, the older daughter and the younger daughter, and, you know, everyone loves the younger daughter because she's beautiful and everyone wants to marry her, and the older one is slightly more serious but really clever and bold and intriguing. And that was Bridget for me. I also like the fact that Lucy Hutchinson, who wrote interesting accounts of this period, was very rude about most of Cromwell's children for being a kind of boisterous and mutton dressed as lamb and getting above their station. And Bridget is the only one that she thinks is actually quite sensible and level-headed. So yeah, that's my heroine. Is she a rebel or not? That's the question in the title, the rebel daughter, or is she the daughter of the rebel, or is she herself the rebel? So lots of questions there.
There's also an interesting switch as well, because I think, you know, you alluded to when we talked about this briefly before, the fact that, you know, you've gone that switch, so that your previous novel obviously was in the colour and the glamour, which I think, you know, you're quite unusual being able presenting that side of the Cromwellian court. You know, the popular view of Cromwell, as we know, is all very dour, and actually we know in reality that this spectacular court that sort of actually held whilst Lord Protector. And now you've kind of gone back to the more homely side of him. Did you find that quite a switch, actually? Sort of, you know, presumably going back to the house in Ely, I suppose, in a way, really.
Very much, very much. And I made a deliberate decision. So in the Puritan Princess, I try and keep Oliver slightly at arm's length, because I'm trying to show that he, even though he is Frances's father, he's still head of state. And so I try and have a lot of scenes where he is across the room and we're looking at him and we're seeing him doing these extraordinary things. Whereas I tried in The Rebel Daughter to make it more intimate, and Cromwell is there in the room and he's smoking his pipe, or he's putting his feet up, or he's taking his boots off, or, you know, he's the kind of rustic, ruddy farmer that we think of him, you know, in the early years of his amazing career. And I loved building that kind of intimacy, and the fact that the house that the Cromwells lived in still exists in Ely and is a wonderful museum. It is just brilliant, because you can go there and feel them around you, and you can think, you know, I was setting my scenes in the kitchen or in the bedroom or in the garden, and I was able to go there and just entirely absorb, you know, what living in this house might have felt like for this large family, large, busy, noisy family, very close family, and capturing that intimacy. And it also allows, this is the beauty of writing fiction in a way, it allows you to make his sort of historical points through fiction. So Cromwell was, many observers at the time, as you know, Cromwell became more and more important in the late 1640s and early 1650s, before he became Lord Protector, but perhaps after, around the time of the regicide and after, were quite amazed, if not amused, by the fact that he still continued to live in London in quite a sort of homely, you know, away. He wasn't very glamorous. You know, he liked to kind of be himself. And, you know, invite visitors into his house, and then he'd have foreign envoys coming in and only be giving them kind of bread and beer, and, you know, be putting his feet up. But that was what he was like. He was very, as we would say today, probably very kind of genuine, wasn't he? He was very
sort of down to earth in a way, really. Yeah. So I mean,
really earthy person. And the opening scene of The Rebel Daughter is him in the fields. And I wanted that. I just wanted to ground him, and from the very start, as this man of the earth, so that almost when, you know, if you've read The Puritan Princess, that he ends up being offered the crown and being effectively king, you're scrolling backwards and thinking, well, how can this man standing in a field doing some, you know, ploughing or whatever, how does he end up getting there? It's a visual way of you know, telling that extraordinary story.
So I can say it sounds like, yeah, as you say, kind of quite a juxtaposition between the two. So, and yeah, and I mean, you know, obviously a quick shout out here to our good friends at Cromwell's House in Ely. We have a very good relationship with, and we have a running joke between us that they have the house and we have the stuff. But yeah, I mean, you know, if you've not got the opportunity, if you've not been there, take the opportunity to do so, because that hugely evocative kitchen, if nothing else, which has changed very little since Cromwell's time. And yeah, you can imagine him parking his feet in the corner and chatting to Mrs. C as she's, you know, helping the servants make dinner and so on. You just feel they've walked out the room, don't you?
And actually, I credit Cromwell's House with perhaps launching my interest in Cromwell when I was a school child, when I was a teenager. My mother took me there on a visit. And I just found it so atmospheric and so extraordinary, and I like to think it planted some of the early seeds of my interest in the period.
Did you find you had to shift your, I mean, you talked a little bit about how you've changed, obviously, the representation of Cromwell between it. Did you find him easier to write this time round? You know, have you changed the way that sort of you approach him as a character?
Well, it's funny. I've said this before when being asked about the characters in the book and how it feels to write about real people. And with the women in Cromwell's family, I have to do a lot of work to kind of bring them out of the sources, because they're so marginalized, and sort of imagine what they would have sounded like, and, you know, really kind of work on their characters. But Cromwell himself, I don't even need to do any work. He just speaks to me. It's probably just I've been studying him for so long. And I think we had this chat, didn't we, Stuart, on one of our other conversations about Cromwell on one of these other videos, that he is just so he's so audible, isn't he, when you study him, his words, and he's so loud, and he's so alive, and such a huge towering person. And he's wonderful to fictionalize, because I hardly need to do any work at all. I just hear his lines just come into my head. So yeah,
I mean, I know you said before you find it very easy to write for him, but I just say, yeah, I think it's just interesting to see sort of whether or not you find that particularly gearing in mind. As I say, it's a very different period in his life, and as you say, that difference between the sort of very distant figure before and now the much more character in the foreground.
I probably did find it a bit easier. I hadn't thought of that before. It's a good question, because this is the Cromwell, in this book is the Cromwell that we probably know a bit better. We kind of in society, you know, this is the kind of Cromwell who's, you know, inspiring his men, and, you know, getting frustrated with Charles I, and kind of running his hands through his hair, and thinking, you know, how can we afford to shoe and stocking the regiment? And this is the sort of fighting Cromwell who's kind of working it out as he goes along, and flexing, you know, constantly with the changes and all the peace negotiations. Whereas the Lord Protector Cromwell is still quite somehow a bit of an unknown quantity, isn't he? You know, how kingly he was, what he was like in that role. And, you know, a lot of people have said, haven't they? A lot of historians have said that he, whether we agree with that or not, that he maybe wasn't a very natural politician. He was a very natural leader, military leader, and he was clearly a wonderful leader, wonderful persuader, and a wonderful inspirer of other people. He could really take people with him, you know, whatever he was arguing. So that was obviously a key part of why he, you know, eventually ended up becoming Lord Protector. But in other ways, the politics were very tricky for him, weren't they?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is very unknown, I suppose, in a way, really, because I mean, it is uncharted waters. You know, this is a sort of a revolution that's almost happened by accident in a way, really. Nobody set out at the beginning of the Civil War for this to happen. You know, it's a sort of series of consequences from the various actions that you end up with a situation of, oh, we've just killed the king, what do we do now? And then, you know, it's dealing with the implications of that, and there is no roadmap for it, I think.
Totally. And I really wanted to get that sense in The Rebel Daughter of this sort of evolution, this kind of running away from everybody, you know, this sort of momentum of what's happening. And I make a real focus actually of the point of a kind of academic point, which we historians always talk about, which is there wasn't one English Civil War, there were three, if not more, and you know, each was successively more desperate and more brutal, and the stakes were higher, and the theatre of war had expanded. And you know, there's this kind of drive towards, you know, what ends up happening with the regicide and then the constitutional experiments in the 1650s. And I really wanted to make that clear in this book. And I partly do it through contrasting three different sieges: the siege of Oxford in the First Civil War, Colchester in the Second Civil War, and then Wexford in the Third Civil War. And this sense that with each one, there's less civility. It becomes a less civil war, a more uncivil war almost. Yeah. But as you say, all the participants, and this is why I admire them so hugely and why they fascinate me, the participants, particularly on Parliament's side, are constantly having to rethink what on earth they're doing, aren't they? And where they go from now, because the goalposts keep shifting. And it's another wonderful thing about fiction is that you can try and put the reader in those moments, looking at those choices, and try and forget for a moment that we do know what happens, and actually present the world much more as it would have seemed to them, which was, you know, just must have been totally chaotic and confusing and crazy. You know, well, where are we going? What are we doing with this? All the constant arguing and deliberating and soul searching. You know, I really wanted to kind of get that into the book.
So the first novel, obviously, looked very much, as I said, the kind of court politics and the sort of that side of sort of of it. And obviously with this one, you know, you're talking about it. It's almost kind of sounds like from what you're describing, and I haven't read it yet. I'm desperate to read it, so really looking forward to getting a copy. But you know, obviously there's an element of a kind of, I suppose, the war movie element to the say out of it in a way, really. I mean, how did you find writing that this time round? Because obviously that's quite different from writing the intimate court politics and everything else in the first book. You know,
it is. It was nice to be challenged to do something a bit different, but. Again, I was helped and hindered, but more helped than hindered, by the fact that I'm writing from the women's perspective, because you know, I couldn't actually have Bridget kind of on the battlefield, at least in most of these occasions. You know, I do manage to have her there on the fringes of the siege of Oxford, because she was there. That's where she married Henry Ireton, was just outside Oxford at the end of the siege. And also at Colchester, helping as an army wife, and then she travels over to Ireland later on, and so travels past Wexford and sees some of the destruction there. So you know, I haven't invented that, but equally, most of the book is still domestic, and it's still the women, you know, talking and, you know, watching these occasions. But I do like to write these scenes of what's happening around the margins, and what are the consequences of these extraordinary events. So Marston Moor, for instance, you know, it isn't portrayed in the book, but what is portrayed in the book is the women waiting for news about Marston Moor, and then the news filtering in through news books, through a letter here, a neighbour gets a letter, they haven't heard from Oliver himself yet, and there's all the sort of, you know, are all of our loved ones all right? Have we won the battle? What's happened? And then you get the opportunity also to use wonderful sources, such as the letter Oliver Cromwell writes to his brother-in-law Valentine Walton, to tell him that his son, Cromwell's nephew, has sadly died in the battle. You know, I get to show the scene of the family receiving that news, and actually that's really lovely to write that from that other way round, rather than, as we always do as historians, we always think of Oliver writing that letter in his tent or in his billet or whatever. Actually, I liked the idea of thinking about how would the family receive that news, because they were a very close family.
Did you get the opportunity to do sort of a bit more of that and sort of actually build in, things that sort of, this is the sort of scene where we can do this bit, this is a bit that I've always wanted to write in terms of, a bit of history that, how can I represent this actually happening?
It's true. It's a real, you can probably see from my gleeful expression, but it is
really
yeah. Because, all the stuff that as an academic historian, you have to imagine or forget or put, say, we don't know about this, we don't know about that. You have you have permission to write, and it is lovely. And I do like to put in little jokes there for other historians and friends of the Cromwell Museum. I like to put little jokes in there. So for instance, we have a scene where after Pride's Purge, where Henry Ireton comes home very late at night and exhausted, and he and Bridget are sitting up in the Cromwell's house study, and then Oliver arrives back at kind of 2 a.m. and walks into the study and says, well, what have I missed? Stuart's laughing because that's a terribly geeky joke, because that's playing on the fact that Cromwell has this wonderful ability not to get his hands dirty with particularly scandalous.
He's very good skill at plausible deniability, I believe, is the current political phrase for that.
And he's away when Pride's Purge happens, and there's all this debate amongst historians of how much did he direct that, how much did he control that, how much was he aware of it, because he wasn't actually there. So just having him come back just after all this, huge dramas happen, he just walks in and is sort of, what have I missed? And it's something that's just a bit of fun for those of us who know the period really well, and also interesting obviously for the general reader, but I like to try and keep both happy.
Oh dear, I was going to say yes, definitely looking forward to this then. So I mean, in terms of the where to go next, I mean, have you thought next about which way, is this going to be another Cromwell daughter, and where do you go next with this?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm actually working at the moment on writing some history, some non-fiction. So I probably want my next book to be a history book, a kind of narrative, popular, easy to read sort of history book, again about the Cromwell family. But I do like the idea of continuing to do both. So I have got ideas for other Cromwell women books I could do. I could do a book about one of the other daughters, or about Cromwell's wife Elizabeth. I had the idea of doing a book about her in the 1630s, which would all be quite stressful, holding Oliver's hand through his, depression.
Bits of depression, and yes, I mean, it could be quite interesting though. I mean, the interesting, the religious conversion and all that sort of thing as well. It could be really interesting.
It could be interesting. I don't think I can face it quite now, because I think it would be quite sort of heavy reading.
Yeah.
But that's, I've got lots of different ideas really for both fiction and non-fiction. I mean, what I want to do is just to continue writing popular books, both fictional and non-fictional, set in this brilliant period. So that's the aim: bring more people to love this period as much as we do.
Absolutely. Well, in which case, more power to your elbow, more power to your computer keyboard whilst typing away on it, Miranda. Miranda, it's been lovely, absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much for taking a bit of time out this afternoon to talk about your new book. And so when's it actually out? What's the official publication date?
17th of February, so not long to wait, everyone. Get your pre-orders in now.
Indeed.
And, yeah, I do hope you enjoy it, and do let me know what you think about it. You Cromwell fans and friends of the museum, give me some feedback. I'd be really interested to hear that. And thank you very much for bringing me on, Stuart.
You will look forward to it, and it will be available both from the museum itself and also from our online shop as well, sort of as soon as its publication date is allowed. So if you want to support the museum, you can also get copies from there. And Miranda, again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Stuart.